Welcome to the World of DaaS, a show for data enthusiasts. I'm your host, Auren Hoffman, CEO of Safegraph and GP of Flex Capital. For more conversations, videos, and transcripts, visit safegraph.com/podcasts. Hello, fellow data nerds. My guest today is Prince Turki, Faisal Al Saud. Prince Turki was the head of Saudi Arabia's General Intelligence Directorate for 23 years. He also served as the ambassador of Saudi Arabia to the UK, Ireland, and also to the United States. And he's the co-founder and trustee of the King Faisal Foundation. Prince Turki, welcome to World of DaaS.
Thank you very much, Auren. It's very nice to be with you.
Now, you recently released a book called The Afghanistan File, which detailed the decades you spent as the head of Saudi Arabia's General Intelligence Directorate and your work there on Afghanistan from the time of the Soviet invasion in 1979. What do most people who are engaged in foreign policy not understand about Afghanistan?
Well, many things, I think, but most importantly is, Afghanistan's had a long history of being at the crossroads of invasions from east and west.
Yep.
And from that perspective, nobody, including for the very first invaders, managed to keep Afghanistan under their rule, going all the way back to the time of Alexander the Great and subsequent invaders. Of course, the most recent in the past century and into this century were the Russians and the Soviet Union, 1979, and then the United States after the September 11 attacks on New York. So that is something I think that those in the general.
But doesn't everyone know that? Like, if you think of, everyone who's been involved in Afghanistan has probably read The Great Game. I'm sure they studied the Soviet invasion. Like they've talked about it. Is it just because they know that, but they don't actually internalize it?
That is, I think, the issue. I think they can do better than the others. And so the eventual result and consequence is that not only are they simply upended by their belief, but also a great loss of human life and material and other expenses that are spent in the process. So I think, if I may, and he respectfully say that even those who have read The Great Game and saw the Soviet invasion and the American experience in Afghanistan is proof of that they repeated similar mistakes that others repeated in the past.
And is it due to a lack of humility, a more hubris? Like, why do you think this happens over and over again?
I think it's a combination of things. It's not just hubris. I can't say that any American commander, let's say, or Soviet commanders were hubristic in their outlook to Afghanistan and thinking that they're superior to the Afghans. But the information that and the means of acquiring information from the Afghan people, I think, was flawed in that they thought their connections with the Afghan people were the most trustworthy.
Yeah.
And one thing, if I learned from my experience in Afghanistan, talking with Afghans and so on, is that you really are always there is always a wall between you and them. They never ever open themselves fully to you. And so, coming to the point of saying, yes, he is my friend or he is my source of information and so on, can be very misleading.
For a while,
is this noise disturbing you that I have around here?
No, it's okay. I think we can edit it out, I think.
Okay.
Now, for a while in the 1990s, the Northern Alliance had some success against the Taliban. Is there anything, like, if we went back if we could go in a time machine and go back, is there anything either America or other supporters could have done to maybe more support them in some sort of way?
I think it's not just an issue of the Northern Alliance, but it's the whole outlook that developed in US policy towards Afghanistan after the initial very successful effort to bring down the Taliban after September 11th. It was almost like, as you Americans would say, a cakewalk for American military. Very easily overcame the Taliban resistance, if that is the right word for it. But then the Americans at that time were chasing bin Laden.
Yep.
To capture bin Laden and bring him to justice. And when they were literally maybe several hundred meters or maybe 2 kilometers or 3 away from him, they simply packed up and moved to Iraq and left him going there. And the fight then was no longer getting bin Laden, but it turned subsequently into fighting the Taliban resistance. So the whole aim of the exercise, which was to get revenge for September 11th, turned into an occupation against the Afghan people. And that's where the resistance gained momentum rather than being destroyed after the initial success.
And it did seem like in September 2001, it seemed like there was a clear mission in Afghanistan. But even within 6 months, it seemed like the mission 6 months later, by 2002, seems like the mission didn't really have any sort of clear purpose. It wasn't even sure what the end game was. It wasn't, and I think it's very hard to achieve success when you don't know what success is. Would you agree with that?
Very much so. As I said, they turned from chasing bin Laden and simply turned their back on that and went to Iraq to do some other thing. So the mission lost its purpose, if you like.
Yeah.
Which was to get bin Laden and bring him to justice.
Now, speaking of bin Laden, you met him a few times in the 80s. What was your impression of him during those times?
Well, initially, he was started off as a do-gooder who would bring humanitarian aid to the Afghan people when they were in refugee camps in Afghanistan, in Pakistan after the Soviet invasion. And as a do-gooder, he opened camps because he was a rich man coming from a rich family in Saudi Arabia. He would support the Afghan refugees in Peshawar and Quetta and bring them medicine, bring them shelter, bring them construction for their camps, etc., etc. Eventually, he got in with a group of Muslim extremists or jihadist groups that had come from Egypt and from Algeria, where they had a different outlook on what jihad is and what fighting the unbeliever. And they, I think, in being with them in that milieu of seeing the suffering of the Afghan people, etc., etc., he began to acquire some of their beliefs and some of their extremist views of who is the enemy and who is not. And by the end of the Soviet presence there, 1989, he, along with Ayman al-Zawahiri, who came from a Muslim Brotherhood background in Egypt, and the jihadist group that actually killed Anwar Sadat in Egypt, formed what was then called Al-Qaeda, which means the base, with another Palestinian Muslim brother who came from Palestine and with jihadist ideas, etc. So these three developed Al-Qaeda and made it into a receptive for those Muslim volunteers who would come to help the Mujahideen and help the Afghan people, and sort of arrange their stay in these camps in Pakistan, and provide them with well-being and care and so on. And then after the Soviets withdrew, when the Afghan Mujahideen began to fight each other, these volunteers became means of getting support from them by the Mujahideen Afghans. So they were turned into military supporters. So by being provided with training in camps inside Afghanistan rather than in Pakistan. So they turned into military forces for the Mujahideen fighters. And from that aspect, bin Laden began to acquire that jihadist attitude and other negative views of not just the America, but also Saudi Arabia and other countries that did not want to exacerbate the fighting in Afghanistan between the Mujahideen.
No, there was a point where he was in Sudan in the 90s, and Sudan kind of kicked him out which is when he went to Afghanistan, where potentially like the world could have maybe intervened. Do you think we could have, if we had gone back in time, do you think we could have done something differently at that point?
I think so. You know, I'll give you an example. Saudi Arabia, for example, in 1995, after he had gone to the Sudan in exile by himself because of his opposition to the Saudi government, the then leader of Sudan, General Bashir, came on a pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia. And he spoke with the late King Abdullah, who was then in charge as crown prince in Saudi Arabia, and said, we would like to hand over bin Laden to you. The late King Abdullah said, well, welcome. We'd be happy to have him because he faces a lot of criminal charges here. But the Bashir told the late King Abdullah, he said, no, if we're going to hand him to you, we ask you not to prosecute him. The late King Abdullah said, unfortunately, we cannot do that because, you know, committing a crime is committing a crime. And everybody who commits a crime has to be brought to justice. So then al-Bashir, instead of bringing bin Laden to us, he offered him actually, and this is according to American sources, to the United States. And at the time, the Clinton administration studied bin Laden's case and came to the decision, this was 1996, that there was no criminal case in the US against bin Laden. He hadn't done yet anything against the United States.
So these they actually before the big bombings in the late 90s.
Right. So they turned him down as well. And that's when bin Laden, seeing that he was being bargained for by the Sudanese leaders, you know, got on his plane and went to Afghanistan, where he was accepted as a refugee.
Interesting. You said that the U.S. kind of practically selected the Taliban as a successor in the Afghani government when we pulled out a few years ago. Can you explain that?
Indeed, and during the Trump administration, there were and even before that, there were negotiations between the Taliban and the then Afghan government, and the U.S. was, in a way, trying to broker a deal with them. And Ambassador Khalilzad of the United States was the interlocutor. At the end of those negotiations, the Trump administration actually began to negotiate with the Taliban without the Afghan government. And simply by doing that, they indicated to those in the know, but also to the general public in Afghanistan, that the Taliban are the ones that are being negotiated with.
Yeah.
And not
so they're the ones with power. And yeah.
Right. And so from that perspective, it became de facto that this is what the United States would accept as a successor to the then situation of the then government and the Taliban. And that's why I said that the US actually chose the Taliban as a successor to the then government of Ashraf Ghani.
Now, in your view, once the US had a little bit more of an expansive view in Afghanistan, let's say after 2001, was a successful endeavor doomed from the start, or is there things that the U.S. could have done differently to have a more successful outcome?
Well, as I was mentioned before, indeed, the initial stages were very successful. And the Taliban government came down very quickly. Most of the cities in Afghanistan surrendered very quickly to the American forces and the Allied forces. It wasn't just America; they had allies with them. But subsequent to that, America turned its back on Afghanistan, and that's when they headed towards Iraq. So they left a vacuum in there. There were still American forces in Afghanistan, but the Taliban got a reprieve, if you like,
Yeah.
from that, and so they began to form themselves into more fighting bands and so on. And that was, I think, the first mistake that America committed. I think the second mistake that America committed was when they, as I mentioned, they began to think of making Afghanistan into a Western-style democratic government with a parliament and elections and all of the paraphernalia of a developed European or American model for democracy. And coming from a very tribal society, some of whose people didn't even, or most of whose people didn't even read or write, I think that was another mistake. To expect that attitude towards democracy will be welcome totally in Afghanistan. And then when America finally got bin Laden under Mr. Obama, if you remember, with the bombing in Pakistan and killing him in that hideaway that he had there, I think that would have been a very opportune moment for the United States. We've achieved victory. We've achieved our aim. We got our enemy, and they should have then started to pull out from Afghanistan. But they let that slip by, and more troops were sent to Afghanistan.
Yeah, it wasn't until 10 years later, essentially, we pulled out.
Indeed. It was amazing, yeah.
Well, it seems like the U.S. intelligence community has made a lot of huge, consistent bad decisions in the last 20 years, especially invading Iraq, also nation building in Afghanistan. From your perspective, why has there been such consistent failures of U.S. intelligence and policy?
Well, coming from an intelligence background myself, I would respectfully say that there was pretty good intelligence, but it wasn't taken seriously by the political leaders. And now we're finding out as documentation comes out, as memoirs are being written, for example, about the Iraq situation, that really the intelligence was there, that there was absolutely no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that were the reason why U.S. invaded Iraq, but that it was a political decision on the part of the Bush administration to do that. So they made that whole story of the chemical weapons in those little trailers, if you remember, the pictures that were shown at the United Nations.
Yeah, and the rods and stuff like that. Yeah.
General Powell, saying, this is proof positive, and behind him was the director of Central Intelligence giving support to that. It was a political decision, basically, not an intelligence. And the U.S., from my experience, the U.S. intelligence is probably ranks way up there in terms of good, solid reporting on issues on the ground. The field work they have is usually very excellent. And of course, they have all the technical means that America is unique with, satellites and other paraphernalia that support their field work.
One success has been the Abraham Accords. How do you think that changes things in the Middle East?
My view on the Abraham Accord is that they left the main substance of the issue in the Middle East and did not deal with it, which was the issue of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And you had Arab countries already before the Abraham Accords, like Egypt and Jordan. They had reached peaceful resolution with Israel. but that left the Palestinian issue still to be dealt with. And then you had the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco and Sudan saying we're going to have normal relations with Israel. So the elephant in the room was kept in the room, which was the Palestinian issue. But these countries, of course, they had every legitimate right to do what they thought was best for their people, but they didn't deal with the Palestinian issue. And you see the effect now, yani, with all of these turmoil that is going on in Palestine, with death on both sides and killing and destruction and so on. So that issue has to be solved for peace to be meaningful. Abraham Accords did not deal with that.
But people have been trying to deal with that issue, for now 80 years or so, and just consistently try, like, at some point, like, can you have normal relations and deal with the issue at the same time?
Well, I think the Arab Peace Initiative that Saudi Arabia presented back in 2002, which was a quid pro quo proposal for Israel, that all the Arab countries would recognize Israel, have normal relations and have diplomatic relations, etc., in return for Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories of 1967. In my view, that would have been the most viable criteria and proposal to be negotiated between Israel and the Palestinians and the Arab states. Unfortunately, Israel never took up the Arab Peace Initiative, and things got from bad to worse. We had the second Intifada, if you remember, in the West Bank and Gaza, and now we have all these issues about the Jerusalem mosque and Israeli settlers taking Palestinian land, and Hamas and others throwing rockets at Israel, and Israel retaliating with bombings, and it's a vicious circle of killing, and tit for tat, kill for kill. But even in Israel now, we see turmoil internally, because the present government in Israel wants even to have a freer hand in doing what it wants with occupied lands and so on. So it's a very, very bad situation for everybody.
And how do you think how do you think it plays out? If you think of the last 20 years, there has been, at least from like an Israeli perspective, there's probably more peace there than there were in the previous decades before that. So there's been more prosperity with Israel. Israel now has a higher GDP than most European countries, right, on a per capita basis. How do you think it plays out over time? Do you think it's a tinderbox waiting to happen, or do you think it's a situation that will just continue to be managed the way it's been managed?
Well, as we're saying, and in the last few months, simply, and the rate of killing on both sides has risen.
Yep.
So that peaceful interregnum, if you like, between 10, 15 years ago and today, I think is probably coming to an end. And I see the way it's going forward is that inevitably, which something that some Israelis more so than I are talking about, is a one-state solution, where Israel will keep the West Bank and its control over Gaza and so on, while maintaining its military occupation of these lands, and simply keep the Palestinian people from acquiring their independence and their rights as a people, and turning into what already some international organizations, humanitarian organizations, have described as apartheid, whether it is the Human Rights Watch, or even the United Nations rapporteur on human rights, etc. So that development is definitely neither for the benefit of Israel nor for the benefit of the Palestinians. And keeping a one-state solution will force upon the Israeli citizens to have to make the choice of whether they remain a democratic, free society as aspired by the founders of Israel and as Israel has portrayed itself for the last 70 years or so, or to become the apartheid state. And that, of course, will have repercussions worldwide. Already we see, even in Jewish communities in the United States and in Europe, there is a growing opposition to the Israeli government and the Israeli policy as a result of this manifestation of I would call it settler hubris, that that they can do what they want regardless of international rules and United Nations Security Council resolutions.
There was if you, from the Israeli perspective, it probably seems though that, let's say in the 90s, they try to put everything on the table. They try to give they try to create this like more two-state solution. They got pretty far. They even had like President Clinton personally involved in putting it together. And yet, when things got to the very end, they kind of felt that maybe the rug got put out, thrown out from under them. Arafat rejected the deal that was there. At least this is their, perspective on it. And then, and then I think at that point they said, okay, well, look, it doesn't, like we gave them everything they wanted, at least that we thought. Now it just looks like the other side doesn't want a deal, so we'll just kind of keep going the way we were going. Is it just that we just need a generation to pass where people forget those types of things, where you have new types of deal makers ready to come to the table, or how does it work?
As you said, Yani, that is the Israeli perspective.
Yep.
If you look from the Palestinian perspective, they will say to you that, yes, Arafat at Camp David under Clinton did not accept what was presented to him. But a couple of months later, in the city of Taba in Sinai, there were talks between the Palestinians and the Israelis under the very last month of Mr. Clinton's presidency, that they reached an accommodation with the Israelis. Unfortunately, President Clinton had to leave because his term of office ended, and Ehud Barak also lost the election to Ariel Sharon. And that sort of, put the thing up in the air again. So that is the Palestinian perspective. I think, and if we're going to try to find blame with each other, the Palestinians will find equal blame to lay at not just the Palestinians, at the Israelis, but at all of us. And the Israelis will continue. That's why today, I think, we have to go forward. And we have to think that the one-state solution is not the proper solution for this crisis. It needs really clear thinking on both sides. And I see in Israeli the manifestation of all of this opposition to the present government is a good sign from the perspective that there is in the Israeli populace people who are disagreeing with the view that things are all right and we don't have to fix them. Like the Netanyahu government has tried to do, not just now, but even before. As you said, Yani, 10 years of more peace than has ever been before. So that is an issue, I think, that the Israeli populace now is trying to deal with. And hopefully it will get us some kind of coalition on Israel that will be able to take bite the bullet and take the step that, yes, we need to compromise with the Palestinians.
Now, Saudi Arabia has recently had a bit of a rapprochement with Iran, which was kind of a sworn enemy in the past. How do you see these two nations interacting in the future?
We've been through this before, and people didn't forget that in the 90s, Saudi Arabia and Iran were also at loggerheads. Because of Iranian intervention in Saudi Arabia, they wanted to turn the pilgrimage into a political rally against America and Israel. And the kingdom said no. And there were, clashes between Iranian pilgrims and Saudi security forces, which led to the death on both sides. Relations were broken then. This was 1986 or so. that happened,
And they had
relations
there was
remained.
also the Grand Mosque seizure in 1979, which you were
No,
directly involved in stopping.
that had nothing to do with the Iranians.
Okay.
That absolutely had nothing. That was an independent sort of, in Christian terms, messianic Islamic group that wanted to take over the mosque and declare, if you like, the end of the world, as happens in some Christian,
Yep.
extreme uh, people that have that vision. But in any case, the Iranians, we broke relations with the Iranians in the 80s. In the 90s, relations were patched up again under the late President Rafsanjani of Iran and the late King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. And the successor to Rafsanjani, President Khatami, actually paid a visit to Saudi Arabia and signed the famous security agreement that was mentioned in the recent statement that came out after a meeting in Beijing. But unfortunately, with the hubris that the Iranians acquired after the American invasion of Iraq, and feeling empowered by that because their arch enemy at the time, Saddam Hussein, was removed, and they expanded their influence in Iraq, and they even boasted that they controlled 4 Arab capitals, Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a in Yemen. Relations with us soured, and their support for the revolution of the Houthis in Yemen and supplying them with ballistic missiles and drones to launch at Saudi Arabia, and then their attack on Saudi oil facilities in 2019. All of that occurred while relations were broken with us after the crowds invaded the Saudi embassy and consulate in Mashhad in 2015, I think, or 16. Anyway, so we've been there before. Now, and in those days, the patch-up occurred directly between the leaders of the two countries.
Yeah.
This time around, there have been talks going on for 2.5 years now, through the intercession of Iraq and Oman in the Arab world. They didn't get anywhere. So I think that's when both sides turned to China. And the new thing about this deal now is the presence of China, not just as a mediator, but also as if you like, as a guarantor of the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
And
this
is
from a Saudi perspective,
this is a new role for China, right? It's a role that I haven't seen China play before. Do you think that's the type of thing we expect a country like China to do more of in the future?
Well, already they're trying to intervene between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
You see that, they feel that they can do things that they hadn't felt before. And I think the Chinese policy over the last 20 years of extending what was called the Road and Belt Initiative, which talked about development and financial aid to countries, gives them the view that they have a responsibility to play a bigger role than they had previously done. So the loans that they give to African countries, to Asian countries, to Latin American countries, also I think plays into that they have an international presence that they should take advantage of. And definitely, this agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because so far both sides signed to it, but we still have to wait if it's going to be implemented. And this is where China will come in. It will have a responsibility to keep both sides of that agreement to their word, that they will implement that agreement. And this is why China is becoming more active, if you like, and proposing to be a mediator between Russia and Ukraine.
Now, internally in Iran, there's been a wave of protests, which have been going on for a while. How do you think those will change anything on the ground in Iran?
Again, I would say that this is not the first time that you have internal issues in Iran. You know, you remember back when Mr. Obama was elected, back in 2000 and when was it, 8 or something like that.
Yep.
There was an uprising in Iran. It was called the Green Revolution, which was, you know, forcefully put down by the Iranian officials. That didn't get anywhere. There were, in the intermediate time between then and even the beginning of these demonstrations by the women and the other, you know, and it become really a national thing, not just women now. There have been several uprisings that were put down. This time around, of course, is that it is much more widespread than ever before, and it involves all classes of Iranian society. And more importantly, the ones who are leading the demonstrations now are the children of the Iranian Revolution. They're the ones who were born after Khomeini came to power. And so it shows you how fragile the Khomeini regime is, because its own spawn, if you like, is turning against it. And but it lacks one thing, or rather two things, I think, which when the Shah fell, they were there. One is a clear leadership, which they don't have. Somebody to you know, to come around and to be a symbol of the revolution. And second, the oil workers that went on strike during the Shah's time and stopped practically all economic activity in Iran then are not there in this time around.
Yep.
Things are still functioning in Iran. You know, transportation, you know, heating, food is coming in, etc. I remember, I'll give you a small story. In 1978, I think it was December 78, after the demonstrations in Iran started and there was, you know, general upheaval and so on. I remember I and my late brother Saud, who was then foreign minister, and another official paid a visit to the Shah. There were some talks that we had to deal with him. I was then director of intelligence. And we went to his palace in Tehran. And as we entered the palace, it was around sunset time. And in the hallway, there were no lights. There was no electricity in the Shah's palace. And they took us by candlelight upstairs to an office where he met us, where he had a small generator in his balcony, giving him electricity in his office so that he could meet us and talk with us. It was to that extent that things had been simply gone to you know, to pot in Iran. Even the Shah didn't have electricity. This is still not available in this present upheaval that is taking place. But it is, as I said, broad, it is all classes, and it might turn into something even worse for the regime if they don't do what is right by the people.
One of the interesting things about Iran, I think that people, at least in the West, sometimes misunderstand, is that it's such a multi-ethnic state. There's all these Azerbaijanis, there's Kurds, there's all these different. It's not just it's not just like a Persian Shia thing that I think a lot of people think about here. And it does seem like it has at least some of these protests have more resonance around some of these ethnic minorities.
Well, you're right. Yeah, I think there are about 7 or 8 ethnicities that are mainstream ethnicities, but even smaller minorities within those ethnicities. Yeah. There is a very lively Jewish community in Iran today, which is not true of other countries in the Middle East. And this goes, historically, and the relationship between the Jews and Iran are several thousand years old. There are also Baluchis that are on the border with Pakistan. They are another ethnicity. There are Arabs on the west side of the Gulf that are connected to tribes in Arabia and so on. You mentioned the Azerbaijanis and the Kurds, but in this manifestation also of the widespread disturbances, the Persian element is equally represented in them.
Yes.
More so than in previous upheavals that they had before.
Interesting.
So it's a broad rejection of the Khomeini regime.
Now, you've said in the past that you thought maybe Saudi Arabia should develop nuclear weapons, which is a bit controversial, at least in the West. How do you think some of these nuclear developments are going to play out over time in the Middle East?
Well, I didn't just say that out of a whim of saying it. I said it within the context of other things that I said, and there has been policy in Saudi Arabia to follow the development of a zone free of weapons of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. This has been on the cards since the Shah was in power in Iran, and the present regime adheres to it publicly, at least. So the United Nations Review Conference on the Non-Proliferation Treaty that was signed in 1962 had in 2010 actually agreed to set up a committee that would look into developing a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And unfortunately, after 2 years of negotiations, and a Finnish ambassador was selected to follow it up, and he traveled all over the Middle East and went to America, to Russia, etc. It came to nowhere. And the first country to back out of it, unfortunately, then was the United States. The view of the United States was that there was no common, consensus for an agreement, and it would be a waste of time to continue to develop that. It is from that context that I said that if Iran develops nuclear weapons, then the kingdom has to think very seriously about that option, as well as the zone free of weapons of mass destruction. So it is not just, for the sake of Iran developing nuclear weapons that we should develop them, but that lacking any development on a zone free of weapons of mass destruction, it's not going to be decided by anyone.
Now, while
that is
Iran,
something I think.
While Iran may not have nuclear weapons today, most people believe that they could have them within a few months if they chose to.
Oh, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
so they essentially have them right at this point, right? If you could have them at any point in time. So if the fact that they quote unquote have it, or they have the quote unquote capability to have it like whenever they want, does one change the other?
Well, what they call the threshold stage of having weapons. Just that stage, of course, means, and which weapon ever invented has been kept as a threshold weapon.
Correct.
No weapon. The atomic weapon that was developed in the Second World War, had America just kept it as a threshold weapon, it would not have ended the Second World War, as it did with the Japanese submission. So we have to think seriously that we need that zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And I presented a paper, I remember, to the Belfer Center in Harvard, making such a proposition for a zone with conditions that the United Nations permanent members, the 5, should be guarantors of that zone, where they would not only make sure that that zone is implemented, but they would also sanction any of the countries in the Middle East that do not adhere to the zone. That is an important condition that should be there, which unfortunately nobody is talking about.
Now, you ran Saudi's main intelligence agency for 23 years. How would outsiders, 24. Sorry, my apologies. How would outsiders not understand about running a big intelligence agency?
Well, basically, it's dealing with human beings. Yani, you run your companies and others run their think tanks or their government departments and so on. It's the human factor that is always there that will decide how successful or badly that institution is run. And if it is efficient and lean and not waste of effort, then it becomes successful. If not, then you have it. All intelligence agencies, can be successfully managed, but also they can be horrible instruments of repression and other, ungodly acts of violence and oppression. But as I said, it all goes back to how one looks at humans treat each other.
Now, because of your past, I imagine you're a big target of like hackers. And how do you manage your own personal OPSEC?
Well, I have been hacked. My telephone was hacked. And I remember in December 2020, I got a message on my telephone, on my WhatsApp account on my telephone, saying, Turki Al Faisal, we have all your life in our hands. We've got all your pictures, we've got all your emails, we've got everything. If you don't comply what we ask of you, we're going to expose you to the world. So immediately I reported it to our cybersecurity officials here, who did the necessary job of identifying that actually my phone was hacked, which I knew. But they told me, keep up with them so that maybe eventually we will be able to trace where that is coming. So I kept with them from December 2020 until
and what did they just wanted money? What did they want?
No, they wanted information.
Okay.
It was obviously an intelligence agency that was not blackmailers,
yep.
Normal blackmailers who seek money. And so they kept sending me questions about Saudi Arabia. What is Saudi Arabia's relationship with Israel? What is the intention of Saudi Arabia in relation with Iraq, etc.? Things like that, and geopolitical questions. And every time, if I am 2 or 3 days later than the time that they set for me, they would send me a picture of me with my daughter or with someone in America or something like that, just to remind me that they have these pictures, etc. So I kept going with them along, and the funny thing was, the hacking initially came from a number from Ukraine. This was before Ukraine was invaded. And that went on until Ukraine was invaded. And then they broke off. They broke off for about 4 months and came back to me with a number from Russia, which was interesting. And moving from Ukraine to Russia, who could do that? I kept, trying to figure out who would do something like that. But that only came once, and then they returned to Ukraine after the Ukrainians regained some of the land that the Russians. So I was enjoying, doing this. It was like playing Risk, Finally, I got one message that defined them to me as who they exactly were, and I knew they were, someone that I'm not going to tell you on public.
Please do not.
YouTube, but now I know who they are. So I just stopped responding to them, and they haven't come back to me yet. Nor have I seen any exposure of my life on either Twitter or TikTok or anywhere.
And since you were hacked, have you done anything differently? I mean, all of us are vulnerable. Have you done anything in your life differently?
Well, I got advice from experts. not only from our cyber people, but I also hired professionals. They're in the market. There are professionals that will give you advice for money,
Yeah.
whether from the United States or from Europe. So I got advice there, and the first thing they told me is change your phone, change your passwords, and don't ever give your password to anybody, or send your details in any manner or form, especially online shopping. Don't ever do it.
Yeah.
Things like that. And of course, never answer any number that you don't know. So these are basically, and they also gave me a little box like this to keep my phone in.
I got it. Yep.
When I
Yep.
don't
Like a
use
Faraday cage or something. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So I've been trying to follow these rules very distinctly, but sometimes human beings being human beings,
Of course.
it's difficult to keep up the rigorous instructions that I have. But as I told you, Yani, for me it was a lot of fun. Yani, I enjoyed it.
Now, one of the biggest energy stories in the last 15 years or so has been the U.S. fracking. Oil production in the U.S. has doubled in the last decade. It's now about 12 million barrels a day, which is even higher than Saudi Arabia or any other country in the world. How
Right.
has that impacted the world, geopolitically?
Well, it has an impact, and before that happened, I would say that OPEC and OPEC Plus had not yet existed by then.
Yeah.
OPEC and other oil producers pretty much were the rulers of the oil market, and how they set prices and things like that. But once fracking came along, it was every man to himself. These frackers, they got the money to bring the oil out, and their main interest is to produce as much oil as they can in order to get as much money as they can to pay the debts that they got from big corporations or big investors and so on. So they were not ruled by any regulations that OPEC adheres to, which is production quotas for certain periods, etc. Meetings regularly to review what is available, what is not available, and so on. And that is when I think all the OPEC countries got together with the non-OPEC countries to do OPEC Plus in order to be able to reach a stable and balanced oil production and price structure. This was in 2020, I think, after the downturn of the oil prices. If you remember, when Russia would not agree to
And
certain
COVID.
proposals.
Yep.
Yeah, COVID came, so and actually oil went into negative costs.
Yes.
And oil
April
producers
2020.
were paying money, for people to take their oil off their hands. But since then, there has been a stabilization of the production and the price system in oil, and the frackers, I think, pretty much also themselves have reached a plateau where there is no anymore, as we see and as we read from publications and so on, there is no more capability to have the big rise in production that happened between 2014 and 2020, when fracking became extensive in America, particularly. So that is something that OPEC Plus has consistently been very much concerned with, which is stable oil prices and stable production quotas.
Interesting. A couple personal questions. You were born in Mecca, which is close to non-Muslims. What's it like to actually live in Mecca?
Well, my living in Mecca actually ended when I was 5 years old.
Yes.
Because I was shipped off to a private school near Mecca, because my older brothers had gone to that school, and I was told, because I don't remember saying it myself, that I kept insisting to my mother that I want to go with my brothers. So they shipped me off to school as a 5-year-old and remained in that school until I was 13. It was in a town in the mountains in Saudi Arabia where the weather is cooler than it is in Mecca. And from there, at 13, I was shipped off to the United States to go to prep school in America. So that was a big move for me. And so living in Mecca itself I have not done. But what I do is visit Mecca on a yearly basis to do my religious duty.
Yes.
And whether it was the pilgrimage when I had to do it, or the lesser pilgrimage, which you do during this month, actually, in Ramadan. At the end of Ramadan, I will be heading to Mecca to do my Umrah. We call it Umrah. It is the lesser pilgrimage.
And
but I imagine, those who live in Mecca has grown in terms of population over the years. So I'm sure it's like any other town, they have whatever it is that keeps them there.
Last question we ask all of our guests: what conventional wisdom or advice do you think is generally bad advice?
Never give advice.
The advice
but
to
I
not
think
give
that
advice
is good
is
advice.
bad, or one should not give advice?
I think that is good advice. That is not bad advice. I think everyone should find things out for themselves.
Oh, okay, great. I love it. This is great. Well, thank you, Prince Turki Al Faisal Al Saud, for joining us on World of DaaS.
Very gracious of you to have me with you, and really, very enjoyable talking to you. Thank you.